Don't touch that coffin. Matilda's voice sliced through the thick, suffocating silence, jolting everyone in the room. The little girl, her 7-year-old frame trembling, pointed a finger at the closed casket where her mother was supposed to rest. Her face flushed with desperation, streaked with tears as she cried, "She's not in there. Mommy's alive." Gasps rippled through the small crowd of mourners, their solemn expressions now twisted with confusion and discomfort. Richard, standing a few steps behind his daughter, froze as if someone had pulled a plug on his ability to move or speak. His hand reached out instinctively, but Matilda stepped further away, her small fists clenched at her sides. "You're all liars," she screamed, her voice roaring and defiant. I saw her yesterday by the window. She was looking at me." The whispers began almost immediately, hushed voices carrying speculation through the room like wildfire. "Poor child," someone muttered near the back. "She's in denial," another whispered, with a pointed glance at Richard. Richard finally found his voice. "Matilda," he said, his voice breaking as he crouched to her level. "Honey, please come here. Let's talk." But Matilda shook her head violently, her braids whipping against her cheeks. "No, I don't want to talk. You don't believe me." "Nobody does." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she turned and bolted from the room. The morning had begun no less painfully. Richard sat on the edge of Matilda's bed, his hands trembling as he tried to find the words. "Matilda, sweetheart, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice hoarse. He avoided her wide, expectant eyes. "Where's Mommy?" Matilda asked innocently, pulling the covers up to her chin. Richard's chest tightened. She's not coming back, baby. Mommy's in heaven now." For a moment, Matilda stared at him, her little forehead creasing. "Heaven? Like in the stories?" she asked, her voice quivering. "Yes, sweetie," Richard nodded, his throat burning. "She's happy there." Matilda tilted her head, processing his words. Then came the question Richard had dreaded. "But why, Daddy? Why did she leave? When will I see her again?" He swallowed hard, unable to answer. The truth was he didn't know why. The doctors had said it was a heart attack, sudden and inexplicable, but Martha had been healthy, full of life just the day before. There had been no warnings, no signs, just a phone call from the hospital that shattered their lives. The funeral itself had been strange from the start. Normally, a burial would happen within days, but for reasons unknown to him, the coroner had delayed the process for nearly a week. Then there was the call. "Mr. Stephen," the coroner had said, his tone flat, but with an undertone that sent shivers down Richard's spine. During the funeral, the coffin must remain sealed. Under no circumstances should it be opened. "Do you understand?" Richard had asked, his voice shaking with confusion and anger. But the coroner refused to elaborate, simply repeating, "It's for the common good." Richard didn't push further. He had neither the strength nor the clarity to argue. The grief was too fresh, too heavy to carry alone. But now, watching Matilda run from the room, he regretted not demanding answers. Outside the church, Matilda had found refuge under the shade of an old oak tree, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, her tiny shoulders heaving with sobs. Richard approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching against the gravel path. "Matilda," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Why don't you believe me?" she asked, her voice muffled against her arms. "I saw her. I know I did." Richard hesitated. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to comfort her, but how could he? He didn't even understand the full truth himself. "Maddie," he sighed deeply. "I miss her too, more than anything. But she's gone, baby. I know it's hard, but we have to try and accept it." Matilda finally looked up, her tear-streaked face defiant. "She wouldn't leave me. She wouldn't, Daddy. I saw her. She was there by the window. She's hiding from us." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The raw conviction in her voice made his heart ache in ways he couldn't describe. Could it be possible? No, it was grief talking? Or was it? Before he could respond, a shadow fell across them. He turned to see Taylor Rowland, his old friend and a detective, standing a few feet away. "Richard," Taylor said, his tone calm but firm. "I just got into town when I heard. I'm so sorry about Martha." Richard nodded mutely, feeling the weight of Taylor's gaze. "I need your help," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Taylor's eyes flicked to Matilda, then back to Richard. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice lowering. Richard hesitated. "There are things I don't understand," he admitted. Taylor folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "Start from the beginning," he said, as Richard began recounting the strange events of the past week. The air in the room was suffocating, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and lingering doubts. Richard was mid-sentence, speaking in hushed tones to Taylor, when the voice of the funeral officiant interrupted, cutting through the atmosphere like a knife. "Mr. Stephen," the man said, his tone brisk and businesslike, "we really need to proceed with the service now." Richard flinched, his hands gripping the back of a pew to steady himself. He turned, his face pale and drawn. "I told you, I need more time," he snapped, the raw edge in his voice startling even Taylor. The officiant, a short man with graying hair and a stiff demeanor, stood firm. "The guests are waiting. We have a schedule to keep, and delaying further would be unorthodox." "Unorthodox?" Richard's voice rose, sharp and uncharacteristic. His grief-stricken expression twisted into something closer to anger. "You think any of this is orthodox? My wife is dead, my daughter is shattered, and you're worried about a schedule?" Taylor's eyes narrowed as he studied the officiant. The man's insistence struck an odd note, his demeanor more clinical than compassionate. He stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe it's better if we take a moment," Taylor suggested, glancing between Richard and the officiant. "Rushing this isn't going to help anyone." The officiant hesitated, his gaze flickering to Taylor, and for a brief second, there was something there, unease, annoyance, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "I'll give you a few minutes," he said finally, his tone clipped as he turned and walked away. As the man retreated, Taylor turned to Richard. "Something's off about him," he said quietly. "What's his rush?" Richard sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, Taylor. Maybe he's just doing his job. Or maybe there's more to it," Taylor said, his voice steady. "You've been through hell, I get it, but that guy's acting like he wants this over and done with more than you do." Richard sank into the nearest pew, his shoulders slumping. "I've been too focused on Matilda to notice anything," he admitted. "She's been asking questions I can't answer, and I can't fall apart. Not in front of her." Taylor placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "I know it's a lot, but listen to me. You need to call this off. Something doesn't sit right here. The delay, the sealed coffin, that guy's attitude, it's all too strange." Richard stared at the closed casket at the front of the room, his jaw tightening. "What'd I even tell everyone?" he asked. "That we're postponing because what? Because the guy handling the funeral seems shady? Because your gut's telling you something's wrong," Taylor said firmly. "And mine is too." The service was ultimately delayed, much to the confusion and quiet disapproval of some attendees. Richard made a vague announcement about needing more time, and Taylor watched closely as the officiant kept his distance, his expression carefully neutral. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the house had fallen into a heavy silence, Taylor stayed behind. Matilda had gone to bed, and Richard sat at the kitchen table, staring into his untouched cup of coffee. "I need to ask you something," Taylor said, pulling out the chair across from Richard. "About Martha." Richard didn't look up. "What about her?" he asked. "The doctor said it was a heart attack," Taylor began, keeping his tone even. "But you didn't see her body, did you?" Richard froze, his hands tightening around the cup. "No," he admitted. "The hospital called me while I was at work. By the time I got there, they'd already prepared her. They told me it was better that way. And then there was the coroner, Anderson, I think his name was, telling me not to open the coffin under any circumstances." Taylor leaned back, his brows furrowing. "And you didn't think to question that?" "I was in shock," Richard snapped, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what to think or do. All I cared about was getting through it for Matilda." Taylor nodded slowly, his expression grim. "All right, but that Anderson guy, do you remember anything about him? What he looked like? Anything he said?" Richard hesitated. He was young, clean-cut professional, I guess. "I didn't really look at him much. I just wanted it over with." Taylor sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Okay, I'll look into him. Something about all this isn't adding up." The next morning, As sunlight crept through the kitchen window, Matilda came downstairs, her footsteps hesitant. She clutched a stuffed rabbit in one hand, her other hand rubbing at her tired eyes. "Morning, kiddo," Taylor said gently, nursing a cup of coffee, his badge tucked discreetly out of sight on the table. "Hi," Matilda mumbled, sliding into a chair beside her father. She looked at him, her face serious. "Daddy, I saw Mommy." Richard stiffened, his eyes darting to Taylor, who sat up straighter. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Richard asked cautiously, his tone tinged with exhaustion. Matilda looked between them, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. 2 days ago, she was outside my window. She waved at me. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Matilda, honey, you've been through a lot. Sometimes, when we're sad, we imagine things we wish were real." "No." Matilda's voice rose, her cheeks flushing with anger. "It wasn't my imagination. I saw her, Daddy. She was there." Richard leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Matilda, please don't do this to yourself. Mommy's gone, and we have to accept that." Before Matilda could respond, Taylor cleared his throat. "Hold on a second, Richard. Let her talk." Richard shot him a skeptical look. "You can't be serious. She's a kid. She doesn't understand." Taylor held up a hand, his gaze steady. "Kids don't make things like this up. Not out of nowhere. Let's hear her out." Matilda's eyes darted between the two men, her frustration bubbling over. "You don't believe me either," she snapped, glaring at her father. "Nobody believes me. But it was her. I know it was." Richard hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not about belief, Matilda. It's impossible." Taylor leaned forward, his tone softer now. "Matilda, I believe you saw something. Can you tell me more? What was she wearing? Did she say anything?" Matilda hesitated. "She was wearing a hat," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "and dark clothes. She didn't say anything, but she smiled at me, and she waved." Richard muttered under his breath, "This is just grief talking." Taylor ignored him, focusing on Matilda. "That's good, Matilda. You're doing great. Did she look different in any way? Was she hiding?" Matilda shook her head vigorously. "She looked the same. She was hiding, though. I think she didn't want Daddy to see her, but she wanted me to know she was okay." Her voice broke, and she clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter. "Please, Uncle Taylor, you have to believe me." Taylor reached across the table, placing a hand gently over hers. "I believe you," he said firmly, glancing at Richard to emphasize his point. "And I'm going to help you figure this out." Matilda's lip quivered, and she gave him a small, hopeful nod. "You will?" she asked. "I will," Taylor assured her. "If your mom's out there, we'll find her. I promise." Matilda exhaled shakily, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she left the table, her stuffed rabbit still clutched tightly in her arms. Richard leaned closer to Taylor, his voice low. "You're not seriously entertaining this, are you?" Taylor met his gaze with quiet intensity. "Look, I don't know what's going on yet, but I do know one thing. Kids don't lie about stuff like this without a reason. You might want to keep an open mind." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. Later that afternoon, Taylor left Richard's house with a sense of unease settling in his gut. Something about the sealed coffin, the strange coroner, and Matilda's unwavering insistence didn't sit right with him. He decided to start with the one name Richard had mentioned, Anderson. The hospital was bustling when Taylor arrived. After speaking briefly with a receptionist, he was directed to the administrative office. The clerk on duty, a young woman with glasses perched on her nose, pulled up the records on her computer. "Dr. Anderson, forensic pathologist?" Taylor asked, his badge subtly visible on his belt. The clerk frowned as she scrolled through the files. "Anderson, let's see." She adjusted her glasses and turned the screen slightly towards Taylor. "Dr. Anderson retired 3 years ago. Moved to South Dakota, I believe." Taylor's eyebrows knitted together. "You're sure no one else by that name works in forensics here?" She shook her head. "Positive. The current lead forensic expert is Dr. Jennifer Clark. Anderson was her predecessor." Taylor thanked her and stepped out into the hallway, the wheels in his mind turning. If Anderson hadn't been active in years, Then who had Richard spoken to? And why would they insist the coffin remain sealed? As Taylor left the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers to these questions were far more sinister than he wanted to imagine. As Taylor drove home that night, his mind replayed Matilda's words. The image of a woman lurking near the playground, hidden among the trees, sent a chill down his spine. If Matilda was right, and Taylor's gut told him she was, then whatever was happening here was far from ordinary. There were too many questions, and not nearly enough answers. Taylor stared at the ceiling that night, the faint glow of the streetlight spilling through the blinds onto his bedroom wall. Sleep was a distant memory. His mind replayed every moment of the past week. The sealed coffin, Matilda's desperate pleas, Richard's blank stares, and then there was Martha. Her name alone was enough to tighten his chest. They'd been friends since high school. He, Richard, and Martha, the three of them inseparable. Partners in pranks, confidants in late-night talks. Even when life scattered their paths, the bond remained. Richard married Martha shortly after college, and Taylor had been there, clapping the loudest at their wedding, feeling genuinely happy for them. When he received the call about Martha's death, Taylor had been out of state, tied up in a seemingly routine case. The words hadn't fully sunk in at first. "She's gone," Richard had said. Just 2 words, but they struck Taylor like a gut punch. Martha was gone. It didn't make sense. She had been vibrant, full of life. He could still hear her laugh, see her wide smile, remember the way she chided him for his stubbornness. The grief that hit him was raw and unrelenting, as if he'd lost a piece of himself. And now, here he was being asked to believe it without question. But Taylor wasn't the type to let things go easily. The doubts nagged at him, fueled by Matilda's stories and Richard's day's compliance. He couldn't shake the feeling that Martha wasn't as gone as everyone thought. By the time dawn broke, Taylor had resolved one thing. He would find out the truth, even if it meant uncovering something that could shatter all of them. The next morning, Taylor parked his car at the end of Matilda's street, far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to see the route she usually took to school. He had told Richard he wanted to follow up on Matilda's claims, and though Richard had been skeptical, he hadn't stopped him. Matilda appeared a few minutes later, her small figure moving hesitantly along the sidewalk. She looked over her shoulder once, her stuffed rabbit poking out from the top of her backpack. Taylor stayed a safe distance behind, his footsteps careful on the cracked pavement. As Matilda neared the edge of the neighborhood, the scenery changed. Houses gave way to a narrow path flanked by trees, their branches arching overhead like a natural tunnel. Taylor slowed his pace, his hand instinctively brushing against the badge clipped to his belt. He scanned the area, his eyes narrowing at the faint rustle of leaves to his left. Matilda continued forward, oblivious to the shadows shifting just beyond the tree line. Taylor froze when he spotted her. At first, she was just a silhouette, a figure dressed in dark clothing, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She stood partially hidden behind a tree, her posture stiff as if poised to flee. But what sent a chill down Taylor's spine was the way she watched Matilda, her head tilting slightly like a predator studying its prey. The woman didn't move until Matilda turned toward her street, and then, as if sensing she'd been seen, she darted deeper into the woods. "Hey!" Taylor hissed under his breath, breaking into a run. The forest swallowed him instantly. The narrow dirt path was uneven, littered with roots and rocks, forcing him to move carefully while keeping his eyes on the woman ahead. She was fast, weaving through the trees with a familiarity that suggested she'd done this before. "Stop!" he shouted, but the woman didn't falter. Branches whipped against Taylor's face as he pushed forward, his breathing ragged. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth, the ground soft from the previous night's rain. The chase stretched on, his surroundings blurring into a mix of green and brown until finally he spotted her destination, a cabin. It was small and weathered, sitting just a few feet from the edge of a lake. A black car was parked to the side, its windows coated with a thin layer of grime. Taylor slowed his pace, his heart hammering as he crouched behind a thicket of bushes. The woman reached the cabin's door, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. Taylor moved closer, careful not to disturb the underbrush as he approached one of the windows. He crouched low, his hands brushing the rough wood of the cabin's exterior. Inside, two figures sat at a rickety table. One of them was the woman. She had removed her hat, revealing short, jet-black hair that looked hastily cut. Even with her altered appearance, Taylor recognized her instantly. Martha. The other figure was a man, younger, his arms covered in tattoos. He leaned back in his chair, his expression hard as he spoke in low, clipped tones. Taylor strained to hear the conversation. "You can't stay here much longer," the man said, his voice sharp. "They'll find you. It's only a matter of time." Martha shook her head, her voice trembling. "I can't leave them like this. Matilda needs me. Richard doesn't need anything except closure," the man snapped. "You've already done enough damage. The only way to protect them is to disappear for good." Tears welled in Martha's eyes. She looked down at her hands, her voice breaking. "I love them. I didn't want this. Any of it." Taylor clenched his fists, his knuckles brushing against the bark of the cabin. He wanted to burst through the door, demand answers, but something held him back. The fear in Martha's voice was genuine, as was the pain etched into her features. The man leaned forward, his tone softening. "You don't have a choice." "Elsa!" Taylor's breath hitched. The name was foreign to him, but the way the man said it made it clear this wasn't the Martha he'd known. Or was it? "Think about Matilda," the man continued. "You stay and they'll suffer for it. You leave and they'll have a chance." Martha, or Elsa, nodded reluctantly, wiping her face. Taylor backed away from the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. His hands shook as he crouched behind the thick brush, his phone gripped tightly. His pulse thundered in his ears, and the faint tremor in his fingers nearly caused him to fumble the device. With his free hand, he swiped open the emergency app, quickly sharing his location with the precinct. "Send backup to my location," he whispered into the receiver. "Possible armed suspects. One cabin by the lake. Stay quiet." A sharp crack beneath his boot betrayed him. The sound snapped through the night like a firework, echoing in the still air. Taylor froze. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Inside the cabin, the low murmur of voices ceased. A shadow moved near the window, then disappeared. "They know," Taylor muttered under his breath. The door slammed open, and heavy footsteps thudded onto the porch. Taylor pressed his body low to the ground, holding his breath. "Stay here," the man barked from inside the cabin. "I'll deal with it." The next sound sent a cold chill down Taylor's spine, the distinct metallic click of a gun being loaded. The man moved through the forest with purpose, his silhouette barely visible against the dense trees. Taylor crawled backward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, but the man was relentless. Sweeping his flashlight across the forest floor, the gun clutched tightly in his hand. "Who's out there?" the man growled, his voice low and threatening. Taylor's heart pounded as he reached for his sidearm, the cold grip a small comfort. He shifted his weight slightly, but the movement caused another dry twig to snap under his knee. The flashlight's beam whipped toward him. "I see you," the man hissed. Taylor scrambled to his feet just as the first shot rang out. The bullet slammed into his shoulder, spinning him backward. He hit the ground hard, his breath leaving his lungs in a harsh gasp. Pain bloomed across his upper body like wildfire. He pressed a hand to the wound, his fingers coming away sticky with blood. "Stay down," the man shouted, advancing. Taylor gritted his teeth, forcing himself to sit up. His gun felt heavy in his other hand, but he tightened his grip. Before he could react, the cabin door flew open, and a figure darted out. "Stop!" Martha's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and panicked. She ran toward the man, her face pale in the moonlight. "What are you doing?" The man turned his head, but his gun remained trained on Taylor. "Someone was spying on us. I'm handling it." Martha's gaze shifted to the figure on the ground, and she froze. Her breath hitched audibly. "Taylor?" Her knees buckled, but she caught herself on a nearby tree trunk. "Why? Why are you here?" Taylor coughed, his voice strained. The man's jaw tightened. "This is why we can't stay here. People are onto you." Martha shook her head, stepping closer. "No, this isn't how we handle this." "Put the gun down." The man sneered. "You're too soft. You always were." He shifted his aim, the barrel now pointing directly at Taylor's head. "No!" Martha lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm. The gun wavered in his grip as the two struggled. "You're not killing him," she said, her voice full of desperation. The man snapped, his voice laced with anger. Taylor seized the moment, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. He surged forward, tackling the man to the ground. They hit the forest floor with a bone-jarring thud, the gun skittering a few feet away. The man recovered quickly, swinging a fist that connected with Taylor's jaw. Stars burst behind Taylor's eyes, but he shook it off, grabbing at the man's collar. The two rolled across the dirt, their grunts and curses punctuated by the sound of fists meeting flesh. A gunshot cracked through the air, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the trees. "Ah!" Martha screamed. Taylor caught the man's wrist, slamming it against the ground until he released the weapon. The gun fell just out of reach, but the man twisted, grabbing a fistful of Taylor's jacket and throwing him off balance. Taylor landed hard, the breath knocked from his chest. The man scrambled toward the gun, his fingers brushing against the grip. Taylor lunged, catching the man's ankle and pulling him back. Another shot rang out, striking a nearby tree. Bark rained down as Taylor wrestled for the gun. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second as the man froze, his head whipping toward the source. "It's over," Taylor rasped, his chest heaving. The man's eyes burned with fury, yet he didn't move. Within moments, the forest was flooded with red and blue lights, and armed officers emerged from the trees, weapons drawn. Dropped to the ground, hands where we can see them. The man slowly raised his hand, his glare fixed on Taylor. Officers swarmed, cuffing both the man and a stunned Martha. Taylor slumped against a tree, energy drained, pressing his hand against the still bleeding wound in his shoulder as he watched the scene unfold. Martha was led away, her head bowed. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and there was no anger in her gaze, only sadness and regret. As the officers secured the scene, one approached Taylor, concern etched into his face. "Detective Rowland, are you all right?" Taylor managed a weak nod. "I've been better. Paramedics are on their way. You need to get that shoulder looked at." Taylor exhaled slowly, his body sagging further against the tree, the adrenaline fading and leaving only the throbbing pain and a burning question in his mind. Why had Martha, no Elsa, done all this, and what was she so afraid of? His sharp eyes remained on the man, whose rugged appearance and tattoos seemed familiar, but it wasn't until they passed under the glare of the police car's lights that recognition struck Taylor like a lightning bolt. "Anderson," Taylor muttered, disbelief lacing his voice. The name slipped out before he could stop it, and the man's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing. The sterile coldness of the interrogation room mirrored the numbness in Martha's chest. Or was she Elsa now? The name felt foreign, almost like a curse. She kept her head down, staring at her hands cuffed on the table, the weight of her lies suffocating her. The door opened, and Taylor stepped in, limping slightly, his bandaged shoulder a reminder of the night's chaos. He placed a file on the table and sat across from her, his eyes sharp and searching. "Martha," he began, then corrected himself with a grimace. "Elsa." The name made her flinch, and she looked up. "I'm still Martha to them. To Richard, to Matilda. I'm still your Martha." Taylor folded his arms, his tone colder than she remembered. "The Martha we knew wouldn't lie to us for years. The Martha they knew wouldn't have her name on an Interpol list." She bit her lip, the sting of his words cutting deep. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to escape my past, to start over. Richard gave me that chance. And Matilda," her voice broke, and she paused to steady herself. "Matilda made me feel alive again. She made me believe I could be a good person." Taylor leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "So why lie? You could have told Richard the truth from the start. He would have stood by you. He's that kind of man." Martha shook her head fiercely. "No, you don't understand. It wasn't just about me. If I'd told him, he would have become a target too. Scott never would have let me go, and Richard would have fought for me, and he would have lost." Taylor's jaw tightened. "So, you lied to protect him?" You think that makes this right? Martha's eyes burned with unshed tears. I didn't have a choice, she snapped, her voice cracking. You think I wanted this? To live every day terrified that someone from my past would show up and ruin everything? To look at my daughter and wonder if she'd grow up hating me if she ever found out? Taylor's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. Martha, or Elsa, whoever you want to be right now, this mess isn't just about you anymore. You need to take responsibility for their sake. She exhaled shakily, her tears spilling over. I love them, she whispered. God, I love them so much. And now I've lost them. Richard stood outside the room, his hands shaking. He'd overheard enough of the conversation to feel the ground beneath him crumble. Taylor stepped out, his face heavy with concern, but Richard brushed past him without a word and entered the room. Martha's head shot up, her tear-streaked face crumpling further when she saw him. Richard, don't, she said, but he interrupted, his voice trembling. Don't, he said hoarsely. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, as if the weight of her lies was too much to bear. Just don't. She stood, her hands still cuffed, her movements hesitant. I know you're angry. You have every right to be, but please let me explain. Explain what? He snapped, his voice rising. That my wife, the woman I've loved for over a decade, is a complete stranger? That everything I thought I knew about you, about us, was a lie? Martha flinched, his anger cutting deeper than she thought possible. Richard, I didn't lie about loving you. I didn't lie about Matilda. Everything I did was to protect you both. He laughed bitterly. Hollow. Do you even hear yourself? You've been lying to me since the day we met. You made me build a life with someone who doesn't even exist. I exist, she cried, stepping closer despite his retreating posture. Martha is real. The love we shared, the family we built, that's real. Please, Richard, you have to believe that. He shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. I don't know what to believe anymore. Martha's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. You can hate me for the lies. You can hate me for my past, but please don't doubt my love for you and Matilda. That's the only thing I've ever been certain of. Her words hung in the air, raw and pleading, but Richard couldn't meet her eyes. The silence stretched painfully, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. You should have trusted me. Martha collapsed back into the chair, her head in her hands as sobs racked her body. Richard turned and walked out the door, clicking it shut behind him. Taylor stood, waiting in the hallway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He watched Richard approach, his friend's face pale and hollow. Richard? Taylor began cautiously, but Richard held up a hand to stop him. Don't, he said hoarsely. Don't defend her. Don't tell me she did it for us. I can't hear it right now. Taylor nodded, his expression unreadable. What do you want to do? Richard hesitated, his shoulders sagging. I don't know. I need to think. Without another word, he walked away, leaving Taylor alone with the weight of the truth and the wreckage it had caused. Inside the interrogation room, Elsa's breaths came slow and shallow as she stared blankly at the table, her cuffed hands resting on the cold metal. The silence was unbearable, but she didn't dare break it. Her chest felt hollow, as though the truth she had fought so hard to bury had left a void in its wake. Taylor sat across from her, his gaze sharp, his presence unrelenting. He flipped open the file in front of him, pulling out a photograph. It was black and white, grainy, and unmistakably damning. This was taken 12 years ago in Zurich, Taylor said, sliding the photo across the table. It showed Elsa, her hair longer, her features sharper, standing beside Scott outside a high-end jewelry store. Both of them had bags slung over their shoulders, their faces partially obscured by sunglasses. Elsa flinched, but didn't touch the photo. That's not a coincidence, Taylor continued, his voice steady but edged with tension. Interpol had you listed as part of the crew responsible for the Zurich heist. You and Scott. At the mention of her brother's name, Elsa looked up, her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Talk to me, Taylor pressed. We know about the heist. We know about the fake death. What we don't know is why you came back into the game, or if you ever really left it. Elsa clenched her fists, the cuffs digging into her wrists. I didn't come back into anything, she said finally, her voice hoarse. That life ended when I walked away. Taylor leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Then why is Scott still involved? And why is he dragging you down with him? Elsa swallowed hard. Scott's my brother. I couldn't leave him behind completely, no matter how much I wanted to. He helped me disappear, but he never forgave me for it. He thought I owed him my life. When he found me again, he gave me an ultimatum: leave Richard and Matilda, or watch them suffer. Meanwhile, Matilda sat on the steps of their porch, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. Richard stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, staring at the horizon. Neither spoke, the weight of what they'd learned settling over them like a storm cloud. She's a criminal, Matilda said suddenly, her voice small but sharp. Richard turned, startled by her words. Matilda, he said softly, it's more complicated than that. Is it? Matilda snapped, her eyes blazing with tears. She lied to us. She lied to me. How could she do that if she loves us? Richard's heart broke at the sight of his daughter's pain, but he had no answers that would comfort her. Sometimes people do the wrong things for the right reasons, he said softly. Matilda shook her head fiercely. That's not good enough, Daddy. She left us? The tears spilled over, and Richard knelt beside her, pulling her into a hug. I know, he whispered. I know it hurts, but we'll figure this out together, okay? Just you and me. Back at the station, Taylor continued to dig into Elsa's past. Every lead painted a picture of a woman desperate to escape her circumstances. The Zurich heist had been a professional job, with nearly $10 million in stolen jewels. Elsa and Scott were the masterminds, evading capture for years, moving from country to country, until their luck ran out in Spain. That was when Elsa vanished, presumed dead in an explosion that claimed the rest of their crew. Taylor flipped through the file, frowning as he reached the medical records. Anderson, he muttered. The supposed coroner who had declared Elsa dead was a man named Paul Anderson. His face a match for the man arrested earlier that night. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together, and Taylor realized that Elsa hadn't disappeared by accident. She'd been forced to fake her death, and that man, Anderson, had been the key. The realization hit Taylor like a blow to the chest. Elsa hadn't just run from her past, she'd been running from him. The tension that had woven through the story finally began to unravel in the aftermath of Elsa's past being laid bare. As the days passed, the consequences of her actions rippled through the lives of everyone she loved, and the emotional cost was undeniable. Richard, despite the pain, continued to care for Matilda with unwavering devotion. Though his heart was broken, he knew that he had to protect her from the chaos that had swept into their lives. But every night, alone in the silence of their home, he felt the absence of Elsa, a void that no amount of love could fill. Elsa, on the other hand, found herself alone in a prison cell, haunted by the wreckage of her choices. She'd been running for so long that she had forgotten what it meant to face the consequences. Now, as the realization settled in, the weight of her past crushed her. The love she had for Richard, Matilda, and the life she had tried so hard to protect had all been lost in the pursuit of her own survival. Taylor, ever the professional, knew that the case was far from over. The arrest of Anderson, her supposed coroner, only revealed part of the deeper conspiracy. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that Elsa had been caught in a web much larger than herself. One that included betrayal, manipulation, and dangerous allegiances. But even as he pieced together the details, Taylor couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Elsa's story than the surface could tell. Was she truly a villain or a victim of her own circumstances? In the end, the story left more questions than answers. Elsa's fate was sealed, but the wounds left behind in Richard and Matilda's hearts would take much longer to heal. They would never forget her, and in the quiet moments, they would both struggle with the truth of what had happened, whether to forgive her or to move on without her. As for Elsa, she was left to face the only truth she knew now, that the past, no matter how far one runs from it, always finds a way to catch up.